Okay, I think we're almost ready to start. So, good evening, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. So, without further ado, let me now. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Eungi Kim, Professor of Korean University. And so, please come on up, and we'll start your lecture.
Thank you. I'm privileged to be the speaker for the 68th Societas Koreana lecture today. To add to the introduction that I was given by Director Yang, I studied in Canada for many years, so my educational experience there allowed me to have more balanced views on the Korean educational system. So today, as you can see in the title, education in Korea is always a controversial issue. No matter what policies are implemented, there are always people who are unhappy. That's why I have a subheading that's recently added, discontent, right? So for the next hour or so, this is what's in store for you. I'll talk about Korean economic development in view of the fact that Korea was able to achieve remarkable economic growth based solely on human resources. So to put that into context, I'll sort of briefly sort of remind you of some of the economic achievements that Korea has made. And then I talk about Korean education, facts. I think even for Koreans, some of these facts are not well known. So I think that will be an interesting part. Then I talk about what Koreans' strong zeal for education has done for Korea. So I talk about the positive consequences. And then I talk about the negative impacts where because we are so preoccupied with education, parents suffer and also students suffer. So I sort of share with you what some of those details are, right? And then I conclude with sort of a synopsis of what's going to happen in the future, okay? So, all right, so let me start with Korean economic development. This is a very well-known fact that Korea has set a miracle in the history of world economics. These days, we have many public employees from developing economies who come to Korea to learn about the Korean experience. And just to give you one idea as to how far Korea has come, look at this. Korea's GDP was only $1.3 billion in 1953, but it jumped more than 1,000 times to $1.411 trillion last year, and that's the 11th largest in the world. And as with the GDP, Korea is one of the top 15 countries in terms of both total exports and imports. And Korea's per capita GNI was only $67 in 1953, but it reached the $20,000 mark for the first time in 2007, and it's now over $27,000. And Korea is now a top exporter of cutting-edge goods. Korea is a top memory chip producer in the world. It's a top producer of smart TV and also top producer of smartphones. And Korea is also the 6th largest motor vehicle manufacturing country in the world, producing over 4.2 million motor vehicles in 2016. Now, when I mention this, I always have to mention this, and that is then which country is the #1 motor vehicle manufacturing country in the world? Believe it or not, it's China at 28 million. And #2 is the United States with only 12 million. So the only reason why we don't get to hear about Chinese cars is because they're all for domestic use. Korea is also the second largest shipbuilder in the world, and you know I could go on and on, but let me stop there. So the question is, what has been the key to Korea's economic growth? And there can only be one answer: human resources. Korea practically has no natural resources with which it could utilize for manufacturing exports or export items. We import metals, minerals, fossil fuels, you name it. So our dependency on these exports is over 90%. So it is no exaggeration to say that Korea's this remarkable economic growth was solely based on human resources. Yeah? So, and when we talk about human resources in Korea, we can talk about two related points, and that is, the government knowing that we lack natural resources, invested heavily in education, and I'll be showing you that in more detail later. And traditionally, Koreans have had this strong zeal or enthusiasm for education. So to put it another way, education has always been an important cultural value for Koreans. Okay? So I sort of jumped ahead there. Why do then Koreans have such a strong educational zeal? Why are Koreans so preoccupied with education? First answer has to do with Confucian influence. In terms of belief and practice, it is believed that Korean society is the most Confucianized society in the world. And when it comes to Confucian influence in education, we could go by talking about how one of the first sayings in Analects, which is the very famous book written by Confucius, he talks about education. And he also believed that education makes a person good. I think we could debate about this, whether that's a correct understanding of what education does. Again, he believed that not only education makes someone more knowledgeable, but that education makes that person good. That is why from more than 1,000 years ago, Korea, China, Japan held state examination to recruit civil servants. Again, it has a longer than a millennium history, okay? And that it was heavily influenced by what Confucius believed in. And the second reason why Koreans are preoccupied with education is that education is seen as the most important means of upward social mobility. Okay? So there is a strong belief in the value of educational credentials. Third, now I don't think too many Koreans believe in the third point. I think reports have been abound telling Koreans how now, if you look at the socioeconomic backgrounds of new students at top universities, like more than 60% of the students come from, roughly speaking, well-to-do families. Okay, so things have changed quite a lot since, let's say, the 1990s. So now, kids from well-to-do families have much better chance of making it to the top universities. So with that in mind, I'd like to now turn to Korean education, facts. And the first one I want to talk to you about is this, that education in Korea is free and mandatory up to grade 9. As you know, in economically advanced nations, that's usually grade 12, right? So we still have a way to go to make this happen. I don't know if this will happen under the new administration, but I don't know if that was his election pledge. Anyway, compulsory primary education was fully provided since 1957. And compulsory middle school education has been provided since only 2004. So that means until 2004, Korean students and parents had to pay for their education from grade 7 on. Okay? But from 2004, parents are only responsible for paying for their children's education from high school and on. Second fact is education in Korea is provided by both public schools and private schools. So this itself is not a surprise, but this one is. Okay? So let me just show you a figure. Okay? So that's the ratio of public and private educational institutes. Meaning, if you look at the primary level, almost 100% of all education is provided by public schools. But that ratio falls, okay? And so if you look at the university, only about 15% of all the students in tertiary education are attending public-funded colleges and universities. So this is really, really unique, I think. And of course in Europe, most of the universities are public, and in some countries the education cost is almost zero, right? Even for university education. But the opposite is true in Korea. Third fact I want to share with you is this: the number of tertiary education institutes in Korea as of 2016. 408. So so I think if you just look at the total, it may not make much it doesn't really stand for great information, but I think it's about the number of students per or the number of colleges per, let's say, 10,000 population. And when you do that, I think Korea has one of the highest number of colleges and universities in the world. The fourth fact is this: as of 2016, the proportion of high school graduates moving on to post-secondary education was 69.8%. So that, even in with the economically advanced nations, that's rather high. And here is a figure. So back in 1980, the proportion of high school graduates who move on to college education was only 27.2%, but the record for Korea is 2008, when 83.8% of high school graduates moved on to college education. Thankfully, it's now down to about 70%, but that is still too high, because research shows that Korean economy is good to handle maybe 40% of high school graduates moving on to college. So while economically developing countries suffer from undereducation, Korea is currently suffering from what we call overeducation. Fifth fact is this: more females are enrolling in colleges. And I don't know if this is a universal trend, but at least in the Korean context, it is believed that the reason why more females are going to college is because there is a rampant discrimination against female applicants in the workplace. So as you can see there, male enrollment has always been high. But for the first time in 2009, you see, 2009, the trend reversed. So from 2009 on, more females go to colleges than males. And the number of primary and secondary school students is declining due to record low fertility rate. So you can see the total number of students, and the striking thing is the fertility rate. So it doesn't show here, but last year fertility rate fell even further to 1.17. As you know, that's like the world's lowest, at least among the major economies. It's very, very low because population replacement level is 2.1. So our fertility rate is roughly half the desired fertility rate. And this has been going on for some years now, right? Like from about 2005. That is why many universities in Korea are facing closure, because it is expected that by 2030, the total enrollment at the university level will fall by, believe it or not, 40%. Okay? So that's going to really bring down the number of colleges in Korea. Again, remember the figure that I showed you, 400 something? That could easily fall to maybe 300. We don't know. But so the decline in fertility rate is not going to not only hurt the Korean economy, but also the education sector. And the last fact about education that I want to share with you is the number of multicultural students that is rising. So I hope you're familiar with this phrase. It's a very Korean term. We invented it. So it refers to children of biracial or bi-ethnic heritage. Okay? And the total now stands at about close to 100,000. Okay? So you can see there the total at the bottom, almost 100,000, and the rate of increase has been very impressive. But the terrible thing is that the dropout rate of these multicultural students has been very, very high. For each level of education, primary, secondary, dropout rate for Korean students is less than 5%. But for these students, it's as high as 30%. So our education system has a long way to go to make these children adjust better to the Korean educational system. And studies have found that most of the students come to school not having full grasp of the Korean language. And that is not surprising, because studies of, let's say, immigrants in Canada and the United States, same thing. They're born in the United States, they're born in Canada, but most of the students who go to school, their competency in English fall far short of native Canadians and Native Americans. So same thing is happening in Korea. But I think the difference is that once they're at school, maybe the effort to make these multicultural children adjust to the Korean educational system maybe falls short or shorter than what is evident in North America. Okay, having talked about how education has been, or human resources and education have played a real important role in enabling Korean economy to grow and to having sort of a shared information about certain educational facts. Now I want to sort of talk about what education has done for Korea. And the first one, obviously, is that, although it's not obvious, but it's something I mentioned, right? That it prompted the Korean government to invest relatively heavily in education. So if you look at the annual budget of Korea from, let's say, the 1950s and 60s, you find that education has always been one of the top 3 priorities of the Korean government. So the top 3 would be economy, defense, and education. Okay? So as you can see in this figure, at one time it was as high as 23.3% of the annual budget, but now it has stabilized around 16-17%. And the number of students, so one of the direct evidence or consequence of the government investing more money into education is seen in the number of students per class. As you can see there, from between 1970 and 2005, for the primary school students, the number fell from over 62 per class to 31.8, and so on. I remember when I went to elementary school in Seoul, I was in a class where there were 68 students in my class, and every other class had a similar size. But over time, with more investment from the government, now it's down to numbers that are slightly higher than the OECD average. So this is not, so if you look at 31, 35, 33, they're not really that much higher than the OECD average. Second positive consequence of the sort of the impact of Korean education on Korean society is that Korea boasts near 0% illiteracy rate and a high school education completion rate. Okay, so the first part, is self-telling, right? So it's like definitely less than 1% of the population who cannot read. And a 2013 study of OECD member countries shows that some 93% of South Korean high school students get their diplomas. Okay, so as you can see there, it's not the red one, it's here. So when it comes to high school graduation rate, Korea has the third highest graduation rate in the world. And the third sort of positive consequence of Korean education is that Korea also boasts one of the world's highest tertiary education attainment rates. So this could also be seen in a more negative light. As I mentioned earlier, we are suffering from overeducation, but at the same time, the high tertiary education attainment rate is something that could be seen in a positive light, or something that could be seen from a more worrisome standpoint. But anyway, here are the the sort of facts. For the age group 25 to 64, Korea's tertiary education attainment is 4th highest in the world. Okay? So this means that 45% of Koreans aged between 25 to 64 have a college degree. Okay? And that's the 4th highest in the world. Now, for the 25 to 34 year old age group, Korea is number 1 in the world. Okay? For this age group, 25 to 34 year old, about 68% of Koreans have a college degree, and that is the highest in the world. Okay? Fourth positive aspect of education in Korea is that in achievement score, in international assessments, Korean students have performed well. And I'm referring to this assessment program called PISA. And as you can see there, Program for International Student Assessment. It's a triannual international survey of students who are 15-year-old. And they do this assessment in more than 70 countries. And Korea has placed ranked top 7 in these items: mathematics, science, and reading. So as you can see there, this is from 2012, mathematics 5, science 7, reading 5. Now, it's not just that Korea has a high rank. What is also impressive about Korean education is that the difference between the top performing students and less well-performing students is minimal compared to other countries. Okay? Maybe that's one of the reasons why Obama has often mentioned Korean education as a model, or maybe he kept on mentioning about Korean education because he happened to have a girlfriend who majored in Korean studies. Have you guys read this newspaper article? Okay, a biography has been just released which recounts how Obama had a serious relationship with half Japanese, half American woman who is a specialist in Korean studies. And they were in a very serious relationship, wanting to get married, but her parents were dead against the union. So they eventually broke up. Sad story, maybe. Anyway, because I always wondered, what makes him think that Korean education should be a model educational system for the United States and maybe for the world? Because as someone living in it, I say living in it because, I've a son who is in grade 10, and I'm going through hell. And I went through hell for the last 12 years, getting my daughter to make it to a university. So, as someone who is living in this system, whenever I heard Obama giving praises to the Korean educational system, I was not happy. Anyway, fifth positive aspect of Korean education is that, of course, industrial growth. So, what this means is that in the process of industrialization in Korea, we had no shortage of engineers, scientists, researchers, technicians, and so on, right? And the sixth positive aspect of education in Korea is it has to do with the country's democratization. You know, as people became more educated, they became more aware of the importance of freedom and democracy. And accordingly, they, you know, demanded for, you know, democracy. And we were able to achieve this finally. You know, the date when Korea became democratic again, we date it back to 1987 because that's when the people got the right to vote for their president again after some, like, what, 15 years where, like in North Korea, we had an electoral college comprising of like 2,000 representatives who handpicked our president. But that ended in 1987. So Korea is one of the few countries in the world, it is said, that was able to achieve both democracy and industrialization almost at the same time, right? Seventh positive consequence of sort of the educational system in Korea is that it led to the establishment of a large number of colleges and private academies, all of which have created jobs. So again, you know, I think maybe half jokingly, for the last presidential election, I think at least one presidential candidate said that if he became president, he would ban all the private institutes. But you know, I don't think that will ever happen because private academies, as bad as they are, hire more than I would say. My easy guess is what, 300,000 employees. So it's a huge industry. Okay? So I think private institutes is probably bigger industry than I don't know what industry I can mention here, but it is huge. Let's just put it that way. Okay? So those are the 7 positive aspects of the Korean educational system. Maybe in our Q&A session, if I'm missing any other positive aspects, you could probably share with me. Let me know. Now I turn to something you know, maybe more sort of serious, okay? Because when I talk about this, you know, as a parent, I really feel this, right? So here we go. So when you talk about the problem of education in Korea, in a nutshell, it comes down to the overwhelming desire, okay, of the parents and of the students to get admission to a top university. Okay, most notably the Sky Universities, Seoul National University, Korea University, and Yonsei University. I'm sure you're all familiar with these names, right? Now, I don't think we should say Sky Universities because it should be Sky Universities. Because of the 3, you know, Seoul National University sort of stands alone as the elite university. Okay? And alumni of these universities dominate Korean society, politics, economy, and culture. Okay? So it is about getting a degree from a top university so that you will have a better chance in getting a job, you know, in getting promoted, and in also in getting married, believe it or not. Okay? When I was, you know, living in Canada, I don't think I've ever had to think where my girlfriend was studying or where she got her degree from. But here in Korea, it matters. Okay? And I don't know about where you come from, whether it also matters. But anyway, I'll share with you some of the examples of how much the alumni of these universities dominate Korea. Okay? And I hope I don't offend anybody who may be a graduate of SNU, because I'm just pointing this out as a fact, not as something that I think it's wrong. It's just it's there, right? So this is I'd like to reiterate this point. Okay, I think if you wanted to just point to one fact, one thing that makes all that sort of puts all these problems associated with education in Korea under one umbrella, it is this, right? That depending on where you get your degree, your life chances are much more affected in Korea than any other country that I know. Okay? And especially it is SNU and Korea University and Yonsei University. Okay, so let's just look at one again. I don't want to offend anybody who is a graduate of SNU, because it's a wonderful university. The most able students go there. But what's happening in society is this. Total number of SNU alumni account for less than 1% in any given year, right? But SNU graduates comprise about 1/4 of all the professors in Korea, nearly 30% of the National Assembly members in any given session, okay? So right now, that is still true. Nearly 40% of legal experts are SNU graduates, and around a half of top positions in government administration are occupied by SNU graduates. Now, let's look at the example of the legal field. Sky graduates comprise, Sky meaning SNU, Korea University, Yonsei, right? Comprise 62.5% of the total of 21,717 legal experts, judges, prosecutors, and lawyers, right? In 2013. Now, here are the numbers and proportion. Now, these figures themselves, nothing wrong with that, right? Because the graduates of these universities studied hard. They're the brains, right? They were able to become prosecutors, judges, and lawyers because they studied hard and they were the best in the field. Now, next slide will show you how the alumni ties, school ties, are making a difference in getting promoted. Here we go. Since the founding of the Republic of Korea in 1948, more than 85% of all the Supreme Court judges have been SNU alumni. Now this is based on appointment, right? So again, here SNU graduates, 40%. But here it's 85. And similar trend is found for the judges of the Constitutional Court. Okay? And 24 out of 28 chief judges of district courts now are SNU graduates. These are also appointments. Okay? So I'm just showing you what is happening in the legal field, but you can look at other fields and you will find that Sky, graduates are overrepresented. And that is the reason why parents, students try so hard to make it to a top university. So in the Q&A session, I want to hear about your own experience in your country whether it's similar to Korea, then Korea is not an exception. Because I can only compare what is happening in Korea with the countries that I study, right? United States, Canada, and as a casual observer, what is happening in Europe, right? So what is happening in Korea is that there is school-based discrimination. And you've heard of glass ceiling, right? So there is definitely glass ceiling for graduates of non-SKY and less prestigious university graduates. Okay, and again, this is another thing I want to hear from you guys, whether there is this school-based discrimination, because in the Constitution it says something like you should not be discriminated on the basis of your race, gender, and also education, right? But it is happening in Korea. So I think what I should also remind you is that what is happening in Korea is not maybe in comparison to what is happening in other countries. It's not a difference in kind, but rather difference in degree. That it is maybe a little bit more rampant in terms of this school-based discrimination. Okay? So a survey in 2015 showed that the most serious form of discrimination in Korea is education. And I wonder how many countries will also show this type of this kind of survey results. So number one was education. Okay. Number two, sexual orientation, and so on. Okay. But in Europe, and I think you can also find similar surveys in North America, the number one source of discrimination, I think a lot of people would say, right? Race and ethnicity, age, physical handicap, and sexual orientation. And maybe sexual orientation can move up, but I'm sure it's the number one should always be not that that those are so different from what you find in Korea, right? So I think this is also very interesting. Looks or appearance also a factor in discrimination. At least that's how a Korean public perceives. So given the rampant school-based discrimination, it is not surprising that many Korean students major in disciplines unrelated to their interests. So so if you have a choice of majoring in a discipline that you're really interested in, but you have a chance of making to that particular university for which you want to major in, and if that university is a second-tier university, and you're likely to be accepted into a university for which you cannot major in the discipline of your interest, then I think students are often sort of forced to choose the latter, okay? Because of this school-based discrimination. So, in a nutshell, it is the pressure to enter top universities that is making Korean education educational system and its details so unique in Korea. And I think I've mentioned this already, indirectly at least. So some of these most desired jobs, you find that the graduates of the prestigious universities are overrepresented. Okay? So the question of why there is such a strong educational zeal in Korea is not difficult to answer. I'm sort of repeating myself, but it is the belief in the value of educational credentials and perhaps more importantly, preferential treatment of graduates of prestigious universities. Okay? And these forces have prompted Korean parents to make endless sacrifices to help their children excel in school. And students also are pressured to make their own sacrifice in taking countless number of private lessons and studying long hours practically every day of the year. So if you have if you live near a school if you live near a school, you probably know, right, that in the playground you don't really see too many children playing, except during school hours, right? And another thing about how students are always studying all the time is that parents who have children in junior high, high school, they cannot really go on a family vacations because they have to worry about their children's education or study schedule, right? They're always taking private lessons. Okay, so to talk in more detail about the negative impact of this education fever in Korea, I'll sort of divide the section into parents' sacrifice and students' sacrifice. And for this part, it's about high spending on private education. Okay? So Korean parents are, of course, under heavy pressure to send their kids to private academies to keep up with the rest or to get ahead. And if I may ask this question, what proportion of students in primary and secondary education are taking private lessons, do you think? Roughly. All of them? 90%. Wow. It's not that high. Okay, so this is the latest data I have. About close to 70% of all the students in primary and secondary schools were taking private lessons, right? And as you can see there, it's been steadily increasing. You know, not decreasing, it's been increasing, okay? And here, I don't know if you can see, but it's a participation rate and monthly spending per student. So overall participation rate stands at about 70%, and the monthly spending, that's an average of, let's say, $200 per month per student. Okay, so whenever I see this, I sort of think that although it's an average, it's definitely lower than what average families spend per student. Okay, but anyway, that's the official figures we have. Okay, that about 70% of students in primary and secondary schools take private lessons, and that their monthly spending is about $200. Okay, and families in Korea roughly spend about 15% of household expenses on private lessons. So again, that's just an average. And if you ever wondered why some Korean parents send their kids abroad to study, because the cost of sort of raising children in Korea, as far as educational spending is concerned, is sort of high, right? So that's why sending them overseas is not much more costly than what it would take to raise children in Korea. And this figure shows you monthly spending per student on private education and you can see that this is the green color is the spending for elementary students, pink junior high, and yellow high school. Okay, so you may wonder, why are Korean families spending more money on private education of middle schools rather than, let's say, high school students, right? And the answer is, I think it's the spending on middle school students is the highest, because I think everyone is hopeful that their children will somehow turn out to be a good student. But when they reach high school, they know now, right? Whether you should continue to invest in your children's education or not. I mean, there's this conspicuous difference here, right? And there's also a conspicuous gap in participation rate and spending on private lessons depending on family income. And I think this is very expected, right? So, for example, in 2015, close to 83% of students from high-income families were taking private lessons. But only 32% of students from the lowest income families did. So the chance of students from well-to-do families taking private lessons was almost 3 times higher than the children from low-income families. And the high-income families spent about $382 per month per student, while low-income families spent only $60, or only 1/6. Okay? So, again, as a parent who has a high school student, and I can say that I belong to this income group, no way that families spend only that much. Okay? I can tell you this much. I think I spend, my family spent about close to $1.1 million for my high school student son. Okay? And I think that's about right. So there is some kind of an underreporting here when it comes to spending on private lessons. Okay? So here we go. Participation rate for the high-income families, almost 83%. For the low-income families, participation rate is only 32%. And the spending there's a very big difference, right? And not only do parents spend a lot of money on their children, but they also pray a lot. So this is they don't pray like that all the time. They do this especially around college entrance exam, right? Or Korean SAT. And there you go. I mean, you can just feel their enthusiasm there, right? Desperateness, desperation. Now, I'd like to talk about this negative impact of education fever on Korean students. So, as I mentioned earlier in passing, Korean students are taking lesson after lesson. This is especially true for kindergarten and elementary students. Okay? It's right after school, they go out, and what do they see? They see this. Okay? This is not school bus, it's a bus from a private institute. Okay? So they're there to take students to the institute, and once they're done there, they have most likely they'll be after the session in the first private institute. Chances are they'll be taken to another private institute, right, and so on. So children taking 2 to 3 private lessons is the norm for the kindergarten, elementary school students. Okay, and recently, English learning among preschool student children has become very popular. Okay, and from the society's standpoint, so I think for those of you who may not have a full understanding of why having so many private institutes and having Korean students go to these private institutes is a bad thing. The reason is this. The main purpose of private institutes is to train students to ace the exams. Okay? And they also teach students to master the level of learning 1 grade or 2 grades higher. So let's say your son is in grade 4. They go to these top private institutes. They're taught subjects in grade 6, for example. Okay? So if they learn all those, when they go to school, do they have anything to learn? So that's why this is especially true in high school, that so many students sleep during, lectures. So that's why I feel so terrible for teachers, because in the past, they at least vented their anger by, doing physical punishment, but now they cannot. They cannot even verbally abuse them now because, students' rights, right? So, the fact that having so many private institutes create jobs, I think that's, a good thing. But I think what they do at private institutes, it's just terrible, okay? So if I had it my way, private institutes, they, cannot close them, but I'll definitely ban this system where the students are taught ahead of their schedule, right? And again, if I have power, I'll also, right now in Seoul, all the private academies are allowed to open only till 10, okay? But before, there was no time limit, okay? But it's down to 10. But if I had it my way, I'll make it to 6, okay? So what that would mean is that only students who need extra help will gain extra help by going to private institutes, okay? And close all private institutes on weekends, okay? Maybe the weekday 6 o'clock is too much. Maybe 7 or 8, but I think even 10 is a little bit too, too much for the students. Second problem that Korean students face is sleep deprivation. And studies show that students in grade 7 to 12 suffer from sleep deprivation, and here are some exact figures. Average total sleep time for non-vocational high school students was 5.5 hours, while the average for junior high school students was 7.1 hours. So just looking at those numbers, is that really that bad? But here is what the US government recommends, okay? For 10 to 17-year-olds, the recommended sleep time is 8.5 to 9.25 hours. So you see, Korean students are sleeping far less than what US government recommends. At least when it comes to sleep hours, American students are living in heaven. Okay? The last one, I have more issue with the mental health, but the studies have found that Korean students are more vulnerable to these mental health issues. because they're all so stressed out about education, about doing good at school, and so on. Okay? And the last one maybe is this, that Korean students, because they live under so much pressure to do well at school, their satisfaction level is one of the lowest among the OECD countries. So OECD average was, the people the students who were happy, who were satisfied with their school life was 84.8%, but only 55% of Koreans said they were satisfied with their lives. Okay, and as someone who lived in Canada when I was a high school student, I could totally understand why this is happening, right? And of course, there's also low social skills of Korean students because they're always studying, right? They have low social skills. And the last one is really a shocking one. It has to do with suicide, right? So when the pressure to excel at school becomes so high, the students take the ultimate pain or freedom and commit suicide. But so it's the number one cause of death for the age, the students in the ages of 15 to 24. Okay? Anyway, I'd like to take questions, if I may. I don't know.
Okay, so maybe we'll go ahead. Thank you very much for that informative lecture. Thank you. And so, just to advise, lectures